We have not been moved to this war by any desire to enlarge our realms. Our desire to serve God and His faith made us put aside all other interests for this cause, hoping only that the Holy Catholic faith will be quit of so constant a danger at our very doorsteps. These infidels of the Kingdom of Granada must be uprooted and cast out from Spain. The borderlands between Castile and Al-Andalus, as the Muslims called it, was a violent and lawless place. On December 26th, the day after Christmas in 1481, Nasrid Riders took to the field and crossed the border into Castile. Their goal eventually came into sight, Zahara, a town in the foothills of the Great Southern Range of Iberia. In what was remembered as a stormy, rainy, dark night, the warriors of the Nasrid Sultan Abu al-Hassan descended on, attacked, and ravaged Zahara. This was a reprisal for Castilian raids. The attack was meant to prove one thing: the treaty that had held the uneasy peace was now broken. It was later said by Arab historians that the Christians were terrorized and without any hope of rescue. A great number were killed by being slashed by swords. The rest were captured and marched off. Abu al-Hassan returned to Granada, very satisfied and content with the good outcome of his venture. This was no ordinary raid. Zahara was not just raided, it was occupied, reinforced, and then used as a forward base. Cities like Jaén, Seville, Córdoba, and many others would now come under attack, if for no other reason than there was very little to oppose the Muslims. The fall of Zahara was one of the final straws in the escalating violence between the kingdoms of Castile and Granada. In the past, the Christian kingdoms in the north, Castile-Leon, Aragon, and Portugal, had grown in power. Through centuries of on-and-off fighting, the Muslims of Iberia were driven back. Even their North African reinforcements, the veiled Almoravid, the ascetic Almohad, and the powerful Marinid, were defeated one by one. Under the warrior kings like Sancho I of Portugal, Ferdinand III of Castile, and James I of Aragon, Al-Andalus was reduced to a fraction of its former glory. But then, Castile, the largest of the Christian realms and the spear point of the Reconquista, had grown weak and vulnerable. In 1474, the same year that King Henry IV of Castile died and Isabella seized the crown, Abu al-Hassan Ali ibn Sayyad took the Nasrid throne. He was an aggressive ruler who had built up the army of Granada, brought in the Guzat, holy warriors from the Maghreb of North Africa, and had even reached out to the Turks for assistance. The success of the Ottoman Empire far to the east, after all, only fueled his confidence and gave him the conviction that God was indeed on his side. Kirsten Downey in the book The Warrior Queen explains, quote, Abu al-Hassan now saw Isabella's rise to power as a welcome sign of Castilian vulnerability. Soon after the princess became queen, and just around the time the Portuguese invaders surged into Castile, he made his ominous vow that he would no longer pay the vassalage payments that Granada had been giving Castile. He delivered his message in specifically threatening words. He said, "The days of Granadan tribute to Castile were over. Those sovereigns who paid tribute to the Christians are now dead, and in Granada, the only thing we are minting are iron and lances to be used against our enemies." End quote. Perhaps Abu al-Hassan had a good reason to feel this way. At Isabella's ascension in 1474, Castile was in turmoil and soon to be embraced in a massive war with Portugal. Indeed, even 3 years into her rule, when the queen came to Seville, once a shining jewel of a city, she noted it was overrun with crime, its Alcazar was in decay, and the nobles were fighting in their own private war. Thus, in 1478, with her hands politically tied and her army engaged against the Portuguese, Isabella signed a 3-year treaty with the Nasrid. Their tribute payment was not even part of the deal. 3 years after this treaty was signed, Ferdinand and Isabella were far to the north in Medina del Campo when they got word that Zahara had been taken by the Nasrid. The question now was, what would they do next? The conquest of the Kingdom of Granada had always been a goal that seemed just out of reach for the rulers of Castile. Suddenly, it had taken on an urgency like never before. The Nasrid were now more than capable of going on the offensive, and they were not alone. 30 years before, the Ottomans had taken Constantinople, ending a 1,000-year-old Christian empire. From there, their armies had advanced deep into Eastern Europe. And the very year before Zahara fell, an Ottoman armada had landed on the heel of the Italian boot and had taken the city of Otranto. They now had a toehold in southern Europe, and if they could link up with the Nasrid, they would be unstoppable in Western Europe. For Ferdinand and Isabella, there was only one final solution. It would be an all-out war. They knew that taking on the Nasrid would be a tough fight, but they were simply not prepared for just how difficult an adversary they were going to be. Granada was a mountainous kingdom. The eastern part of the country held a formidable range, nearly impassable to an army. In the west, however, there were mountainous river valleys that penetrated deep into the interior. However, imposing strong points, castles, and fortresses protected every road and pass. Every major city like Ronda and Granada were built into citadels. Its Mediterranean coast had vital seaports like Malaga, Marbella, and Almeria, where food, supplies, and troops were ferried in. Abu al-Hassan had also spent years building up the army. David Nichole in the book Granada 1492 gives insight. Quote, a review in 1478 estimated that the Nasrid had 4,700 cavalry and 50,000 infantry. The Granadan military elite was the Emir's Guard of Mamluks, also known as the Malughun. Recruited from young Christian prisoners converted to Islam, they were educated in the Alhambra Palace. They were regarded as renegados, traitors by the Christians, intended to receive poor treatment if captured. Unlike the Mamluks of Egypt, however, these men could expect their own sons to reach senior military positions. The motivation of Granada's military personnel was a mixture of traditional religious commitment and enthusiasm for defensive jihad, plus a personal honor code that had much in common with the chivalry seen on the Spanish side of the frontier. The permanent professional corps of the army largely consisted of cavalry based in fortress garrisons like Granada, Malaga, Ronda, and Guadix. The Emirate of Granada was very strongly fortified. However, Moorish strategy reflected their limited resources. It was essentially defensive. End quote. Now, as remarkable as the defenses of the Kingdom of Granada were, it also had many weaknesses. First, compared to the rest of Iberia, this was a densely populated area. When most of Al-Andalus had been captured by the north, the Muslim refugees had settled here. Feeding this population was a daunting task. There were fertile areas around every major city which were intensely cultivated, known as vegas, which helped provide some of the food. But these same farmlands could also be a great liability if they were captured or destroyed. Second, food was a major import which kept the ports busy, but these same ports could also be blockaded. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the political structure of the Nasrid was not stable. Rivals in the Nasrid royal family, and even prominent noble families like the Banu Sarraj, were consistently struggling for power. Granada was anything but internally united. Ferdinand and Isabella had their work cut out for them. The former used his impressive military insight and began formulating an overall strategy. The latter got to work shoring up alliances, calling in favors, raising funds, and sorting out logistics. They were a powerful couple, and in war, an even more formidable team. The first step was containment. Troops were sent to the borderlands to strengthen defenses while the rest of Castile and Aragon could mobilize. The bulk of the navy was also sent in to blockade Nasrid ports. Studying the maps in detail, Ferdinand came to the conclusion that this would have to be a systematic, meticulous campaign. He was regarded by historians as comparing the conquest of the cities of the Kingdom of Granada to picking out the seeds of a pomegranate. It had to be done one by one by one. However, just as meticulous and precise and calculating that the royal couple wanted to be in this war, their nobility decided that they had other plans, which involved rushing right in. Rodrigo Ponce de Leon, the Marquis of Cadiz, wanted payback for the Christians that were slaughtered at Zahara. On February 28, 1482, he and his army moved under the cover of night and took back roads to avoid being detected. They launched a surprise attack against Alhama, which was located deep within Nasrid territory. This town, ironically, was considered the eyes of the kingdom as it kept watch on all the incoming passes and served as an early warning system. Strategically, it was vital. It lay on a crossroads, including the road that connected the capital, Granada, with the fortress port city of Malaga. The Marquis' men moved in the shadow of a stormy night. They scaled the walls, opened the gates, and slaughtered the population. A Muslim historian would later say, the walls, the streets, the temples were left filled with corpses and bathed in blood. The Castilians then threw the bodies over the walls of the town, creating a moat of the dead. It was vicious, it was cruel, and it would set the tone for the rest of the war for both sides. Abu al-Hassan had to respond. He needed this vital town back. When his troops arrived at Alhama in March, they saw wild animals and stray dogs chewing on the remains of the corpses. This gruesome sight instigated intense fury, but when they attacked, they were thrown back by the Castilians, and the town would remain in the hands of the defenders. Later in May, Ferdinand would heavily reinforce the garrison. For the rest of the war, Alhama would be a knife at the throat of the Nasrid kingdom. After all, as the crow flies, it was located less than 20 miles from Granada. Ferdinand and Isabella now moved their headquarters up to the Alcazaba of Cordoba to plan their first royally sanctioned offensive. The early win at Alhama bred a certain degree of hubris, and so they decided that their first target would be the fortress of Loja. The troops that they brought in were from northern Iberia and were poorly experienced in fighting the Nasrid. In early July of 1482 near Loja, Ferdinand set up his camp on a hill hoping to use it as an artillery position, but his troops were scattered over a large area and this left him greatly exposed. The Nasrid garrison of Loja was comprised of lightly armored but fast-moving cavalry. When they saw Ferdinand's poor preparations, they devised a cunning assault. They divided their cavalry into two contingents, one racing in to lure the Castilians off the hill with a feigned retreat. The other contingent lay in hiding, and when the Castilians were chasing the first group, they raced in to attack the Castilian camp and the artillery batteries. Ferdinand at this point did not know which way to attack and was sandwiched between the two Nasrid groups. Chaos would ensue, and his men suffered just horrendous losses. Even the master of the Order of Calatrava was struck down when he was hit by 2 poisoned crossbow bolts. On July 7, 1482, Ferdinand had to order a general retreat, but this too was very poorly coordinated. Once again, the Nasrid cavalry took advantage of the situation, raced in, and slaughtered the Castilian line while it was on the march. The defeat at Loja was a major blow. Ferdinand arrived back at Cordoba with a fraction of his forces, and Isabella was horrified at the losses. Any illusion that this would be a quick war was now put aside, and the two Christian monarchs realized that they were contending with a very worthy adversary. But not all hope was lost. Isabella's connections in the papacy were having an effect. The Pope began to send in funds and declared that their conflict was a religiously sanctioned event. For the Nasrid, this had always been jihad. Going forward for Isabella and for Ferdinand, this was not going to be just a major conflict. For them, this was now going to be a holy war as well. Abu al-Hassan was jubilant. He traveled to Loja to celebrate his victory. The man seemed that he was unstoppable on the battlefield. However, despite how good he was on the Castilian front, his home front was a completely different matter. As he arrived at Loja, he got the dreadful news that his own son had rebelled against him, and in the process had taken his capital. Let's step back here for a second. Aisha bint Muhammad ibn al-Ammar, also known as Aisha al-Hurra, though some reference her simply as Fatima, was the strong-willed wife of Abu al-Hassan. When the Nasrid Sultan began to favor one of his converted Christian slaves in his harem, she grew angry. When Aisha learned that this concubine was pregnant, she became, intensely resentful. Now it should be mentioned that she had a son with the Sultan by the name of Muhammad XII, though he was known to the Castilians as Boabdil. Aisha al-Hurra persuaded her son that it was now time for new management. Muhammad No. 12 readily agreed, and while his father was off fighting, he staged a coup. Boabdil was supported by the powerful Banu Sarraj family, and with their help, he was soon lord of the Alhambra. The Kingdom of Granada was now divided between those who supported the young Muhammad, based in Granada, and his father, who had made Malaga his new capital. Arab chroniclers would lament and say, "This was a terrible rebellion that split open our very souls." The war with the Christians, however, was by no means over. In fact, the Castilian nobility, sensing weakness, now decided to move in on their own accord. From their forward base in Alhama, they decided to move on the rich, vital seaport of Malaga. They put on their best attire, brought out their fanfare and trumpets, and brought along with them plenty of empty wagons anticipating a lot of plunder. The Marquis of Cadiz, if you recall, the man who took Alhama and knew just how fierce the Nasrid were, urged strenuously against this move, but he was ignored. On March 19, 1483, the army moved out. They made no attempt to conceal their movement through the narrow mountain passes. They were quickly spotted. Abu al-Hassan sent in his brother, Muhammad XIII, also known as al-Zagal, to intercept this incoming force. Al-Zagal divided his men into three components. The first was to block the path of the Castilians, the second to sneak into the mountains surrounding the Castilian force, and the third contingent Al-Zagal commanded personally. He rode around the enemy army, arriving in the rear to block any retreat. The Castilian aristocracy marched right into this trap. Their heavy armor made movement difficult, and the mountains negated their ability to mount a heavy cavalry charge. When Al-Zagal gave the order to attack and his men rode in, it wasn't so much a fight as a complete and total massacre. Many Castilian noblemen were killed, the standard of the Order of Santiago was taken, and the Marquis of Cadiz barely escaped with his life. For the Castilians, it was another crushing defeat. Ferdinand was appalled and disgusted with the hubris of his men. He knew a new game plan was needed along with a better sense of caution and respect for their foe. Isabella realized that it was time to restructure the logistics of their army for a much more prolonged conflict. She also began building hospitals to tend for the wounded. Victory in the Reconquista now seemed as distant as ever. Meanwhile, Abu al-Hassan and his brother al-Zagal were now war heroes to their people. Their prestige exploded. Boabdil, if you recall, the young Muhammad, however, saw this as a threat to his leadership. He knew he had to be his father's equal on the battlefield if he was to retain his crown. He decided to one-up his dad and took the war into Castile. The young Sultan gathered his army and his best commanders, and in April of 1483, he marched on the Castilian city of Lucena. The city came under siege, but on April 20th, a relieving Castilian army came in. Boabdil abandoned the siege to engage them. The ensuing fight was initially just a brutal confrontation. In the midst of the fighting, the young sultan attempted a feigned retreat, but as he moved his forces back, he encountered another enemy contingent shouting, "Remember Malaga! Remember Malaga!" They were shrouded in the morning mist, and the actual number of these men could not be discerned. Thus, the Sultan, fearing that another large force was moving in, ordered his men back again while his cavalry protected his withdrawal. The Nasrid force eventually moved to the Rio Henal to cross at a ford that they had used before, but when they arrived, the river was swollen by spring rains and now the ford was inundated. Retreat was now essentially cut off, and when Boabdil's best commander was killed, his front line broke, and the Castilians took full advantage. They surged forward and decimated his army as they went. The Sultan himself was thrown by his horse into the river, where he attempted to hide in a bunch of tall reeds, but he was soon discovered. He would not have time to watch his army get absolutely destroyed. Instead, he was dispatched quickly to Córdoba, and in a few days he stood before Isabella and Ferdinand. The two monarchs referred with their most trusted advisors on what to do next with the young, brash Boabdil. The majority of the suggestions that they got really came down to either keeping him captive forever or executing him. Isabella, however, came up with another option that Ferdinand liked a lot. The two treated him with incredible dignity and respect, showering him with gifts. Ferdinand would even go so far as to embrace him and call him a close friend. The Sultan ate it up. When Aisha al-Hurra, again also known as Fatima, offered ransom to get her son back, Isabella accepted, and on September 2nd, 1483, Boabdil was released after he assured Ferdinand and Isabella that he would restore the peace and the tribute. It was a bit of a gamble to let him go, but it paid off. As calculated, the young Sultan and his father would soon be back at odds, and the internal division of Granada would be as fierce as ever. This is perhaps one of the reasons why Ferdinand was Machiavelli's poster boy. This action assured that the Nasrid civil war would continue. It would seem that their high command was doing Ferdinand and Isabella's work for them. In late 1483, the tide began to turn against Abu al-Hassan. His forces were defeated at a great battle at Lopera, and in October, Zahara was retaken by Castile. That winter, Ferdinand greatly expanded his army. He created more cavalry forces, and taking a cue from his opponent, he began to raid the emirate with a newfound vengeance. Early the next year, in 1484, the armies of Castile and Aragon drove deep into Nasrid lands. Their goal wasn't so much to capture territory or cities, but rather to destroy crops and farmlands, and in doing so, to obliterate the food supply. Many Muslim cities and towns now began to face starvation. Even the Vega of Granada was raided. To intensify the pressure and really drive home that attrition, the Castilian navy was reinforced at Gibraltar, and Nasrid ports were nearly cut off through blockade. Isabella sent a stern warning to the Genoese and the Venetians who were aiding the Nasrid. She stated that there would be, quote, serious reprisals if they continued to help the Muslims. Italian interference at this point came to an end. Ferdinand then brought in his artillery. On June 20th, 1484, after a prolonged bombardment, the city of Alora fell, followed by the town of Setenil on September 20th. His plan was working. The cities of Granada were falling one by one. The Aragonese king quickly realized just how effective his cannons were, and he set to work expanding his artillery corps. The size of his weaponry grew so big in terms of quantity and also in caliber that an entire corps of engineers had to be created in order to level roads, build bridges, and expand passes in order to get the massive cannon into place. While the Spanish cavalry would continue to raid and keep the Nasrid forces at bay, Ferdinand's artillery would lumber into place and level fortresses that were before impregnable. By 1485, the war had become more severe, brutal, perhaps even sinister, as both sides were exhausted with the prolonged conflict. Chivalry was giving way to maliciousness. On the home front, the Inquisition was going into high gear, rooting out heresy and traitors. 20 people in Seville alone were burnt at the stake. Rebellions in the borderlands were no longer tolerated. In the case of a border town that had a Mudéjar uprising, Mudéjar being Muslims living under Christian rule, Ferdinand moved in and viciously crushed them. He ordered the entire population to be enslaved, and the town leaders, over 100 of them, were to be hung. With these minor rebellions taken care of, he unleashed his army, not just to raid as he had done the year before, but now to conquer. After bitter fighting, the cities of Coin and Cartama fell in April of 1485. The Aragonese king, however, was just getting started. Meanwhile, earlier that year, Abu al-Hassan had grown ill. Some called it a heart attack, others called it a stroke, yet others say he was poisoned. He retired and died soon after, almost as foreshadowing. His concubine, the same one that caused all the previous trouble, renounced Islam, converted back to Christianity, and in time would become a lady in Isabella's court. Abu al-Hassan's brother al-Zagal was appointed the next sultan, and just like his predecessor, he too would prosecute the war with conviction. Al-Zagal had his work cut out for him. By this time, most of the western portion of the emirate was in the hands of the Spaniards. Only one major citadel was left, the city of Ronda. Ronda was built into a very defensible position, located atop a mesa and surrounded by cliffs. Despite the war raging all around it, the Nasrid garrisons of Ronda would continue to operate, raiding on any weak Castilian city and exploiting any target of opportunity. Thus, it was here that Ferdinand would next turn. A direct assault on the city, however, even with his cannon, could easily be routed. He knew he had to do something else. In early May 1485, Ferdinand maneuvered his men towards the city of Malaga, again the most valuable port in Nasrid hands. Al-Zagal maneuvered quickly to prepare for this incoming attack. He stripped the garrisons of multiple other locations in order to reinforce the port city. Even the garrison of Ronda was ordered to come in to aid in the defense. That attack never came. While Ferdinand moved towards Malaga, or at least appeared to do so, he deployed the Marquis of Cadiz with a fast-moving contingent of his army to maneuver back to Ronda and quickly place it under siege. When Al-Zagal figured out that he had been fooled, he immediately deployed the garrison of Ronda back, but it was too late. The city was now under siege and weakly defended. The Nasrid garrison, furthermore, was unable to fight its way through the Spanish blockade, despite multiple attempts, and had to fall back. In the process, they left the inhabitants of Ronda to their fate. Ferdinand now rerouted his artillery and brought the city under the big guns. The ensuing bombardment destroyed a big chunk of Ronda and set off huge fires that gutted the interior. He also ordered the stone stairs to the city which led down to the river to be destroyed. Doing this effectively cut off its water supply. Thus, the population that was surrounded, constantly under attack, and now without water, grew more desperate by the day. After 2 weeks of absolutely stout defiance, on May 22nd, the city of Ronda surrendered. Kirsten Downey gives us an astonishing tale. Quote, "This victory was very significant to Isabella, because capturing Ronda freed some 400 Christian slaves who were being held there. Among them were some of the people who had been seized back at Zahara. They were weak and starving and in need to be nursed back to health. Queen Isabella ordered the heavy chains that they wore to be placed in carts and hauled back to Toledo. There they were to be hung on the exterior walls of the monastery of San Juan de los Reyes as a reminder to worshippers of the hardships that the Christians had suffered." End quote. Oh, and by the way, those chains that Isabella brought back, they still hang there to this day. With the fall of Ronda, the western portion of the Kingdom of Granada would also fall, including the vital port of Marbella, which was taken later that year. But despite their successes, Isabella and Ferdinand had brought their treasury, their country, and their people to the breaking point. Casualties were heavy on both sides, and they knew that mistakes had been made. However, for the first time since the war began, the path to the capital, Granada, now seemed like a very real possibility. That said, Al-Zagal was more determined as an opponent as ever before. Despite the advantages that the Catholic monarchs had in terms of men, material, cannon, the Nasrid Sultan was going to make them pay for every inch of conquest. Al-Zagal was going to prove that one does not simply walk into Granada.